Hi again, and welcome to the continuation of the lecture on narrative for hyperthematics. I'll call this lecture 4.5. Last time we talked about narrative and books, and we'll continue here. We talked about Hypertheme 8 last time in terms of narrative. We drew that out of narrative. What we said was, with Hypertheme 8, make your elements transformable rather than replaceable. And so we compared the chess pieces to words, and we saw words were so much more malleable than chess pieces. And this, I suggested was how narrative spreads in a crazy way and brings us all together in some larger shared interpretations. So words, sentences that are made up of words and stories are flexible. And there are various elements of narrative. And if we just take a word like dog, for example, it brings all sorts of images and connections to mind, right? Some of them are subordinate to dog, part of being dog itself, and some of them are related to many other things. So hairy and barking and types of dog, the dachshund and the beagle and the golden retriever and whatnot. And things like chewing on slippers and pet and puppy and then dog shame, different words and so on. So any word you choose has this malleability and flexibility in what it can connect to, what it is in itself, how it can be spoken in your way, how it can be mixed in sentences and phrases and whatnot. So words are one element and in narrative, and people are another element. So a person engaged in narrative can be a listener, but then the same person can be a speaker, telling someone else about the story, the narrative in their own way. Someone can be a reader and then a writer, and then can go back to being a reader again. And on a larger level of sentences, phrases, stories, even series of stories and adventures you might read, we say things like, what did you get out of it? And everyone will get something different very often. There can be subtle differences, or there can be huge differences in some cases, depending on your context, your cultural context, who you are, and whatnot. So, everyone who reads a novel or hears some story told will imagine the characters and events in their own particular way. So if you compare this to chess, we talked about symmetry a bit before. Chess has a certain symmetry relative to narrative. Chess is sort of this against this, two experiences which are relatively to what's going on in narrative the same. And this is visible in the relative replaceability of the elements, right? The two chess players, for example, are in a sense replaceable, in a sense that not in terms of their skill level and their experience with the game, but if you say, okay, we want two people who are at level 7 or whatever, two people who are not quite up at grandmaster level who have a rating of such and such, right? And they're not exactly replaceable, but they're much more replaceable than narrative, and so as well for the pieces and for the board itself. There's a symmetry in the board, and there's symmetry in the pieces, and there's symmetry in this side against this side, right? So if we go back to what I spoke about before, our little schema, experience and different experience and interpretation between them, what we can say is that as we approach symmetry in experience, that is, as we approach experience and similar experience, there is less and less to interpret. There's less and less of a problem to solve in an interpretation. So from the left side here, you can see the difference with the right side. We've taken the same color, and in that aspect, these two elements are relatively the same. And so as we do this, our tendency is for there to be less and less of a problem to solve in the interpretation, right? If this is not different from this, all the less can we make some interpretation which solves it. We can still make interpretations, but the interpretations are going to tend toward quantity and then eventually toward one experience. If we keep going, for example, if this differs from this in nothing but space, well, we can start moving them together in physical spatial terms, right? And eventually they'll become one experience when they come to the same space. But before we get there, what we'll get is that the experience, the different experience, will be just one more of the same. And so it moves us toward quantity and toward numbers as quantity. This one plus one more, and so forth. There's a value to this, but the value is lesser. But all value at various ranges of complexity of experience has to connect. So the value of numbers in that quantitative sense connects to higher level value. There's a range of value, not a certain cutoff where we can say here's quantity and here's quality, but we'll talk more about this later. So as the experiences lose differences, aspects to interpret, they're less able to spark complex interpretations between them, and they begin to reduce to yes, no, left, right, true, false, on, off, 0, 1, and so on. This is what I call, and Royce called, the dyadic tendency, and it's a tendency which is built into the architecture and the thinking behind modern computers, and it has a certain effect in our experience of data and so on. And we'll talk more about that later. This experience, this action of moving towards sameness, moves us toward this dyadic logic of binary in computers, 0 or 1, this or the other one. But in our human physical, particularly physical and human experience, it comes out in the fighty aspect, for lack of a better word, of whatever it is that we're doing. So if you think of an argument between two that doesn't get to the level of fist fight between two people, it comes out in the sense that we can't both be right. I'm right and you're wrong. No, I'm right and you're wrong. And think of this in very basic terms, in terms of the way children act sometimes. I have an object between them, right? Some toy, but the idea is not there that can be mine and yours, that it can be something more than an object, that it can be a process. The idea is that it can only be mine or it can only be yours. So it's mine, no, it's mine, and tug of war back and forth. So the move, the tendency toward this dyadic logic gives a competitive aspect to games and also to sports, and we see it very often in sports. Whenever there is this symmetry, there tends to be competition of fightiness, this contest, me against you, us against them, I win, you lose, and so on. I don't know if you can see this, but and boxing is a good example. There's not much to interpret between the boxers. Each boxer takes the body of the other boxer as a sort of an element with which, within the rules of boxing, they'll interpret. The interpretation runs around these two elements, the two physical human bodies, which are, for boxing purposes, relatively the same. And so this brings them down to this me or you aspect in their various actions. But of course, boxing and other sports and games are still consistent with H for reasons we talked about earlier, because their core hyperthemes are still consistent. They still look for that interpretation with the other, and they don't eliminate one another. They box to box another day. I mean, all things being equal. So in narrative, humans are treated as transformable, as I said. So you have a writer and a speaker, and the writer or speaker passes on to someone else, and then you have a reader or a listener. listening and reading, and then gets transformed, still the same element, still the same human, but transforms and becomes a new writer, speaker. And so narrative is moving away from this symmetry. Word elements for me can be very different from what they are for you. They're transformable. And the people elements are also transformable. And this is what H means. But we can draw more out of it, as we'll see in a moment. Complexity again. Narrative is thus more complex than games. And we'll talk a great deal more about complexity later. So besides being made up of variable components, words are better at promoting transformations. There are more words, and there are more types, varieties of words than for game pieces. And there's no exact dividing line, no exact cutoff for hyperthematics. I only, when I'm, when I remember myself, talk of tendencies. Right? Lewis Carroll with Alice in Wonderland and his poems, Jabberwocky and so on, he was very good at playing with this transformability, this malleability of words. And he could turn them around and he could give them opposite meanings to what they had, and he could play with them in many ways, and yet we still understand it and we draw something out of it. The way he plays with them allows us to make interpretations which solve whatever he wrote and get totally new and wonderful things in it. And there are hybrids, of course, between games and narrative, like, for example, Dungeons and Dragons, where you have that fighty aspect, yes, for various reasons, but you also have sort of a constant transformation of what the elements are. So the players, the roles of the players, and it's very good at expanding on the basic transformability of the person as an element in narrative. In Dungeons and Dragons and similar games, you have the person acting as this and acting as maybe something else, acting as dungeon master and then taking on some other role, for example, and switching, being different characters and whatnot. And so this is a hybrid between narrative and games, and it works very well if you think of the popularity of games like this. So the passing on of problems in interpretations is not about passing on an object, for example, a book. If you can imagine a book without words, sort of a bound together bunch of pages, that would be closer to an object. I would say it's object tending. It's not really a book in the sense of a book with narrative. And this is not what's passed on in narrative. Right? We'll talk more about objects later as a tendency toward which is devaluative. Again, back to comparison between, say, a novel and the chess game. And this relates to what I just said about objects. Just like you can have a book, you can have a played game. For example, a famous game in chess, game of the century between Fischer and Byrne, 56, where Fischer sacrificed his queen, did something completely strange. But books arising from narrative are richer. You can replay that game of the century for yourself. You can play it out even without another opponent or with someone else. And you can hypothesize, well, what if he'd done this? What if Byrne hadn't taken the queen, or could he have got out? But there's a limit to it. If you stay within chess, you can only go some small way away from that original game, right? Compared to how far you can go with a novel, for example. So the game, here the chess game, is passed on as something relatively fixed. The problem is mostly solved in terms of that game that we played. It's mostly solved by Fischer and Byrne. But not so with the narrative. The narrative is an open problem. It's passed on as something, well, with a deliberately open problem. So, for example, good novels have unanswered questions, backgrounds that you have to fill out, things unsaid. How many novels have you read and things like, well, they get together finally, and what on earth is so-and-so thinking when they did that, even though it's only fiction, right? But you can play with it. And so the words and their complexity relative to games have a huge end in this. So something like Treasure Island, for example, Stevenson's Treasure Island, you read it and you think, well, I want to be Jim, or maybe I don't want to be Jim. And could I do what he's doing there? I wonder if there's any gold out and back in the old place I know, or wherever, and so on and so forth. And it sparks this in you because of the words themselves, their history, the way they're strung together by Stevenson, and so on. And this is what good novels and even less good novels do. So if we go back to our method, we're going to, we can formulate this as hypertheme 9. And we'll say it like this. If you increase the number and the transformable range of elements, and transformable range here is just a fancy sort of technical word for what I call the aspects of interpretable experience, which are built into an element, and they don't have to be built in by humans. They can be built in by nature. It's not a human thing. It's an experience, a process of experience thing. And you can think of it, if you like what do you call them? Crazy contraptions. So is an element more like a crazy contraption or less? Right? And words are more like crazy contraptions. And narrative turns people even into crazy contraptions. So the number of aspects, the range of aspects that the element has, in the case of a word, that it's made up of letters, and it can be said in certain ways, and it has certain linkages and certain history and so forth, and certain grammatical relations. This is its transformable range, and that's greater than the transformable range of a solid chess piece on a board. So if you can increase the number and the transformable range of elements in your community, you pass on structure and problematic. And this gives you more growth of the structure, in this case, growth of narrative. And it reduces your ability to solve what's being passed on. But on the other hand, if you reduce the number and transformable range of elements, you increase solution of the structure and you reduce its growth. So if you go that way, you're moving from the richness, the crazy contraption, which is the word, back toward something like the chess piece. And if you go the first way, you're moving from the chess piece toward something like the crazy contraption, which is the word. So chess, in other words, is relatively still chess when someone sees you play and begins to play it, takes it up. The chess structure, here one of various game structures, is kept and transferred. So we always play like this within our chess structure. And so chess is easier to solve than a novel, right? And in fact, checkers is easier, again, to solve than chess, because that the pieces, the elements, are even less like crazy contraptions. They're less transformable. And checkers has already been solved with a whole bunch of computers and 18 years worth of work by a fellow, Jonathan Schaefer, and his team at one of the universities in Alberta. But I don't doubt that they're working on a complete solution to chess, right? Where you know every possible move. But a novel, well, a novel is relatively not still a novel when someone sees you and takes it up to read. Narrative structure is, relative to chess, less kept and transferred. More problem is transferred. The novel is more difficult to solve, more of a problem, and if you ask what is the exact meaning of this novel, you're going to get a whole bunch of meanings, depending on who you ask the question to. And so for anything like a complete solution, it'll be a lot longer before a computer can give us the solution to a novel. To just put it in another way, What do you do if you don't like chess? Well, you just don't play it, right? The heck with that. But what do you do if you don't like a book? Sometimes you don't read, but let's say it's not reading that you don't like, but this book, right? This particular book, you read it. I disagree with that. You may very well read it, argue about it, and argue a lot about it, criticizing it, and say, you know what? I disagree completely with this book, and this is why, and this is why, and this is why, and listen to me. And what's happened? You've become enmeshed in the structure of narrative. This is the power. I shouldn't say power because I'm going to use power in a completely different sense, but we slip back into these things. This is the power of narrative in terms of those crazy contraptions, which are the words and how the structure of narrative treats people as narrators, as listeners and readers and writers and so on. Next time, well, this time we've finished off narrative, and hope you had some interest in that. And next time we'll talk about dance. And until then, thank you for watching, and bye-bye for now.